context, input, learner, command, and connectedness. My name is Alejandro Bodipo-Memba, and I'm the founder and CEO of OVP Management Consulting Incorporated. My biggest aha moment around learning my strengths was when I finally figured out what context actually meant. It meant that I wasn't crazy and that I was able to look at the world in a way that made sense by looking backwards to solve problems in the present and in the future. And I'm thankful to my father, who basically gifted that to me at birth.
I'm Darren Verisami.
I'm Brandon Miller.
And this is The Strengths Whisperer, the show empowering leaders to create, build, and sustain great places to work. On this episode, I'm excited to share that we have Alejandro Bodipo-Memba, the CEO of OVP Management Consulting Group, Incorporated. Joining the show, Alejandro, great to see you, my friend, and welcome to the show.
Darren, it's great to be here with you once again. How are you?
I'm doing great, man. How about you?
Doing amazing. You're really glad to be here.
Yeah, we're really happy to have you. Listeners, you're in for an extra special treat today with Alejandro, because Alejandro and I have worked together on strengths. Our organizations have partnered together over the years and have done a lot. So we have co-facilitated many engagements. His strengths knowledge is second to none. It's absolutely incredible. And we've gotten to work alongside of each other, figure out how to lead different components together through the filter of strengths. And that's exactly what we are going to get into talking about today. Alejandro, when you first took the assessment, what were some of your top 10 that really stood out to you?
Well, when I first took the assessment many years ago, I was struck by a couple of things. First and foremost, I was struck by the influencing domain that was represented, which was in the form of command. Command is a talent theme and has become a strength for me in ways that I have not actually anticipated. And it really showed up as a surprise to me because I previously had thought of myself as being much more cerebral in nature, much more strategic thinking. That was actually represented quite well in my top 5. But when I first encountered with the assessment, command struck me as odd. I really didn't know what to make of it. And until I got into strengths and the definitions and understanding what command actually shows up as a strength, then it became a bit more obvious to me. But at first, I was surprised.
That brings up such an interesting point right out of the gate. The perception that we have when we see a single word and don't have the context, don't have the understanding for what the word actually means through a strengths-based lens from the Clifton Strengths perspective. Can you dig a little deeper for us into command? Like, what was your initial perception of what command meant versus understanding what it actually is? And does it actually resonate now, many years later, that it's actually very much a core part of who you are? Does that align for you?
Yeah. So when I first was encountered with command, I assumed that it had more to do with telling people what to do, providing almost like a militaristic approach to your engagement, to your leadership. And if I'm being honest, I was a little bit taken aback and thought, well, gosh, I think I'm a nice guy. I'm a pretty easygoing person. Why would command be in the top 5 of these so-called talent themes or strengths? But as I've learned over the years and certainly have come to appreciate, the notion of command is actually a real gift for me because it serves as a bit of a modulator for how I'm showing up publicly and in the work that I do, which is frankly very important for me to be able to recognize in the moment when I'm utilizing the optimal aspects of command. So when I show up in my command now, I recognize that it demonstrates a level of competence and confidence with respect to the subject matter that I'm sharing. It also provides a level of confidence for the audience that I'm working with, that they can in fact react or respond to me with a level of certainty that, hey, this person knows what he's talking about. And when I think about my use of command then versus now, it's much more about how it is I'm walking into this idea of a new circumstance, whether it be a new individual coaching scenario, a new cohort that we're facilitating with together, or a new client in general. The fact is, I know that I can lean into the elements that make up command in such a way that while I may be new to the game, I can show up in my authentic self and be confident that I'll be received in the manner that I'm intending to. Whereas before, I didn't have the confidence to kind of lean into my command as a strength.
So interesting. And some of that might have had to do with your own perception of what command was and your own perception of what others' perception of what command actually is. And the presence that it brings to the room when it's in there. And again, being that subject matter expert and being able to sit in that and own it, not from a place of arrogance, but from a place of humility and a place of strength in understanding what you do know, because it is humble to own what you're good at, to do that in a way that doesn't make you better than other people in going along. And when command shows up in a refined form, which it very much does, having worked alongside of you and seen you in action many times, probably close to a decade now, we're not quite there, but for quite some time, it's been pretty powerful to see. So that was kind of your surprise strength that was in there. Alejandro, you mentioned you expected to see more of these strategic thinking themes. Can you unpack those a little bit more and why you felt like that more cerebral side of you would be showing up really strongly on the assessment from when you took it?
Absolutely. So I think it's helpful to go backwards, and you'll hear what I mean by this. But in the context of my own personal life, I was raised by two parents that relished the notion of education as being the savior for any individual. And my father, in fact, was a history professor at the university level. He emigrated to the United States as a young person to study. That was, in fact, his pathway to formulating a family and how he taught us in our lives about understanding values. And the manner in which I was educated at home really reflects how I approach my work, how I approach solving problems for clients, etc., in the here and now. However, my meaning-making formula really requires me to approach historically facts that have taken place in order for me to make sense of the present and the future. That automatically brings into play strategic thinking talents like context, input, and learner, which happen to be my top three. And so I think I came to this notion of strategic thinking, honestly, by the family influences that really helped shape the way in which I make sense of the world, how I actually look at problem solving. And so I'm always fond of sharing with folks that ask, which of your top five resonates most strongly with you? And invariably, when I'm sharing, context is one of those that always comes up at the high level in terms of my sharing of my strengths, how it is that my strengths really show up to me in a natural way. The way in which I have sought to make sense of educational circumstances, picking a major, deciding on what areas that I wanted to focus on in my profession, really has forced me to look back and say, okay, what has moved you, Alejandro? What is actually moving you in this particular direction? And that notion of context, looking backwards to make sense of the now and the forward, well, I can't say it's never failed me, but it's certainly the way in which I have found success working in the area of strengths, working in the area of collaboration, for example, with you and the folks at 34 Strong, and with a number of others that I've had the good fortune of working with over the course of my career. And so I think the notion of strategic thinking really has shown up in that regard. One other, I'll say, tributary to that journey has been the connecting of strategic thinking strengths with this notion of understanding how they connect with continuous improvement. And the notion of continuous improvement vis-a-vis Clifton Strengths is really about finding pathways to sustainable performance improvement. And making those connections for me has been a really big aha moment or light bulb scenario where I now understand why my strategic thinking strengths have a connection to the process-related work that I do on a day-to-day basis.
It's interesting that your story was very much based in context, looking back to look forward of where we're at. And on that same thread, because not only do you have context, you got learner input, as you said, that make up your top 3. Number 7, you have intellection. Number 10, you have analytical. Those are 5 of your top 10 are strategic thinking strengths. Deliberative at number 9 is an executing strength. And there's many elements of it that are very strategic in nature in risk calculation, like really trying to engineer the risk out of scenarios as we're moving forward. So it's very, very interesting to just see how that's manifested. And it brings up the whole question. You told the story of dad, of your parents, the fact that they immigrated to the United States and that journey. I share a similar story, as you know, and that risk assessment of when you've come from places where maybe things were a little more scarce than some of the abundance in the US. It's going to make you really have to think through, do I need to do this? What is the reason for making this choice? Because you come up with a very different perspective through that lens. And with that, Alejandro, I think what's fascinating in your journey, you founded OVP quite a few years ago. In your journey of leadership before that, when you were in organizations, were you always strengths-based, or was that something that awakened at a different point in your career that started taking you down the path of pursuing this notion of strengths, maybe even before you knew of Clifton Strengths? Can you share a little bit about that perspective when you look backwards in the rearview mirror?
100%. It's great that you asked that question, because my introduction to Clifton Strengths came back in 2012 when I was working for a large electric utility and was really trying to find my path through leadership. I was a recently promoted manager for corporate communications for a large electric and gas provider in the Midwest, and had really found a path, if you will, or seen a potential path for engagement with respect to leadership. But I didn't have a previous connection to Clifton Strengths. In fact, I'd never heard of that particular assessment. Prior to that, by the way, I had practiced as a business journalist for many, many years for a lot of large organizations that you may be familiar with. I was with the Wall Street Journal, with USA Today, and for a number of years worked for the Detroit Free Press, covering organizations around the country. And my path into the corporate arena really allowed me to leverage that work into a leadership role. However, I was introduced to Clifton Strengths for all managers that were going to be moving up, that were identified in the organization as high potential. And it wasn't until then that I understood why so many of my colleagues and friends were engineers and why they loved their work in terms of engineering. It wasn't until I was introduced to this notion of Six Sigma, or continuous improvement process design, which is really seminal for a lot of people that go into engineering style occupations. And so as a relatively new formal leader, I was introduced to Clifton Strengths. And that was my before and after to where I think my career trajectory has taken me over the last 22 years. And that I have figured out that before Strengths, I had an idea as to the type of individual that I was. And I probably could have named some areas of strength that I either possessed or had the potential to maximize. But it wasn't until Strengths that I had language to really support my conjecture about myself. The fact is, I now had a clear understanding of how I showed up, not only to others, but to myself. Some of my blind spots were relative to how I show up in leadership. In other words, looking at the intention that I had showing up as a leader versus the actuality. Strengths really has allowed me to clearly understand my approach to leadership, be present in the here and now as I am executing on my intended leadership goals. And it allowed me also to, frankly, be of benefit to others who are seeking pathways to better understand how they're showing up as leaders, because I was able to recognize not only in myself, but in others when strengths were being optimized or when they were in a suboptimal manifestation from a behavior perspective, right? And I think it was in 2012 when it really came together for me that, oh, not only is leadership this idea, this concept of helping people get from point A to point B, but it's an actual practice that you need to dedicate time, energy, and effort towards to make manifest. And you mentioned earlier, Darren, this idea of deliberative being my number 9. And while it is not technically a strategic thinking strength, it really does show up as a strategic thinking / executing strength, at least as it is practiced in my life, right? As in my leadership. And so I think this idea of being introduced to strengths in my formal journey as a leader helped me figure out or identify and then how I could become the best leader that I could be. And over time, strengths has been born out as being that foundation for me to really say, yeah, I think I'm on the right path. I'm demonstrating. And when I'm off or being deviated, I come back to that foundational principle of strengths. And it has really not failed me.
Thanks for sharing that, Alejandro. I want to really hone in for our listeners on one of the last pieces that you said there when you were talking about deliberative and how it shows up for you. That is just gold, because it's easy when people are first getting into strengths. Like when you think back to yourself back in 2012, over 10 years ago, when you were first exposed to Clifton Strengths and you were going through it, it's easy to look at a list and say, oh, Alejandro, Darren, you share learner, command, connectedness, achiever. They must be the same for you. And that couldn't be further from the truth, right? Because your brand of learner is going to be influenced by context, input, right? Deliberative. Those are in my bottom 10, shall we say. So from 25 to 34. So the way that your learner shows up, your brand of learner, we'll see similarities, but there'll be some differences. I heard an analogy years ago when I was first getting into strengths and learning about it. And somebody shared this. It was really simple. If you're a coffee drinker and we were to take beans from Colombia and we were to take beans from Sumatra, right? And we were to take them and we were to convert them into a cup of coffee, brew them identical, the same amount of scoops, whatever it is, and we brew them identically. Would they taste the same, Alejandro?
Of course not.
Of course not. They might even smell a bit different, but yet they're coffee. They might both give us energy. They both provide us caffeine, but the environment in which those beans were raised creates their own unique properties. And that's the important part when you get into the place of digging into our strengths. So that whole notion of self-awareness that you and I have been lifelong students of here and continue to share with those that we serve, it's about continuing to deepen our understanding of, well, what is a learner for me? What are the different ways that maybe I can aim that and it can show up? And how does that pair with those that I'm working with? You and I work together a lot. How do our learners work together when we're in different situations? I'm just using that as an example. I know you have something to say. Fire away, my friend.
That's exactly the unique gift that we have with strengths, because as you were describing, the uniqueness of each of our takes on our strengths demonstrates that strengths is not about personality. Otherwise, we would all be the same cup of coffee if we shared the same strengths. Rather, it's how we are showing up to each of these identified strengths. Because just like you were saying, and we were commenting just before we got on air, the hat that you're wearing is a wonderful hat. If I have a similar hat, it's going to be the same hat, but it's going to fit me differently. And how I show up to it, whether I'm wearing an Adidas sweatsuit or whether I'm wearing a tuxedo, is going to have an impact on how that strength, that hat is going to manifest. That's how it's going to show up. One of the things that I really was excited to learn about a couple of years into my strengths journey was this notion that the Clifton Assessment is not about telling us who we are. It's much more revelatory of how we show up, as opposed to saying, hey, Darren, you are a maximizer. Well, if I take at face value that somebody's telling me that I'm these things, I'm automatically going to start thinking about these in binary ways, as a positive or negative. And as we both know, the notion of thinking of strengths as a positive or a negative is a trap. If we think about this idea of strengths in a binary way or in an oppositional way, we automatically get into this hierarchical determination of what is a good strength and what is a bad strength. And one of the things that you and I both know is that when Donald Clifton put together this masterpiece that is an approach to making sense or making meaning, he was very intentional about not putting in a strict hierarchy one strength over another, but rather the way in which each of us as human beings come to those strengths, we have the opportunity to maximize the elements of relator, the elements of maximizer, the elements of context. And that's one of those things that, for me, keeps me coming back to this well that is Clifton Strengths, because ultimately I am going to be different today than I was 5 years ago, and I'm going to be different tomorrow than I was today. And depending on what's happening in my world will have an influence on the relative manifestation of my strengths. And each day I need to be reflective on how I can best show up to those strengths to become of service to my family, my friends, my clients through the prism of strengths.
That's right, Alejandro. And what you said is we evolve. We're different. Biologically, like I have some scruff on my face right now. If we recorded this 5 years ago, there wouldn't be as much gray from 5 years ago. The hair follicles that are on my face have strength to keep producing hair. Why are there so many gray that come out now? Is there a paintbrush in there? I don't know. But these are the things that we look at. But our strengths are no different. They have to evolve with us, right? And I'm just talking about like the biology of like, we see this in real life, and our strengths are going to mature as we grow, as we change, as life circumstances happen. I definitely grew and shifted when I became an entrepreneur around the same time that my first child was born, and these different pieces that came together. And then when I retook the assessment 8 years post having had those experiences and really having grown from like a solopreneur, or not really solo, it was myself and Brandon, but it was just the two of us, to where you're actually truly growing and scaling a team and working. I felt like, God, these results are not resonating with me, with who I am. Just want to ask one more question in this space because of some of the insights that you've brought in your personal journey of where you're at. You're speaking to yourself 10 years ago, 15 years ago, as you're aspiring, working through the ranks of leadership. Maybe you were recently promoted to leadership. What are you telling that version of yourself that you didn't know at that time based on what you know now through the lens of strengths?
That's such a provocative question and a really insightful one, Darren. I think one of the things that I'm telling myself about what to expect with regard to this leadership journey is that it's a journey, and that leadership is not a destination, but it's a path. And with strengths, you have mile markers to be able to follow that path. And there are options to take forks in the road. But as long as you have your strengths as your mapping system, your GPS, you really do have an opportunity to get better at being the best that you can as a leader, formally and informally, both recognizing what it is that you tend to do or tend towards with regard to leadership in certain circumstances, and what those tendencies often lead to. So you can become much more predictive in your own leadership with regard to certain situations that all of us as entrepreneurs, as business folk, as people that have worked in large organizations, have run large organizations, have been confronted with, I should say. I think something else that I might say to my former self is, don't get enamored by words on a page. Rather, take the insights that have been generated as a result of you taking the assessment and run with that language. The actual title, the word of command, the word of deliberative, that's just merely an indicator for you to say, hey, this is the particular strength that's popping most at the moment. Be cognizant of all of the language that describes that behavior, those tendencies, and soak that in. Really focus on the behavioral manifestations of the word as opposed to identifying yourself with the word. You are not a commander, Alejandro. While command shows up, don't fool yourself into thinking you must take a particular captain major perspective. So those would be the two of the things that I might suggest sharing with myself in hopes of having an even brighter path with regard to my journey.
Thanks for sharing that. I always love hearing those answers and being asked that question, because somebody that's listening out there is actually exactly in a very similar situation to where you were at that one point. I got to ask you, you lead with strategic thinking strengths. I lead with influencing strengths, right? I've got maximizer, activator, self-assurance, command in my top 10, and learner. That's my one strategic thinking strength in my top 10. We've worked on lots of projects together. We've worked within organizations together, side by side in different realms. How have you seen those domains working together, Alejandro, in terms of how we've operated successfully together and how we've created success not only for ourselves, but for our clients in terms of the work that we've done? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, no pun intended, Darren, but our strengths influence one another. They really do. It's interesting that you're mentioning that in this context because I'm actually working with a number of clients to help them better understand how domains can support one another as opposed to individual strengths, but actual domains for teams can support one another, particularly in the areas of relationship building and influencing. But as it relates to our working relationship, which spans 6, 7 years, almost 8 years now, I can share with you this. I think we have, aside from the personal friendship piece, but we have a really good understanding of not only what our strengths are, but how each of us manifests them. So I recognize immediately, and you've actually heard me say this in circumstances when we're going to be co-facilitating. Hey, if you want to lead the bus, if you want to drive the bus, I'm just right there next to you and vice versa. And we invite each other to understand, hey, this may be how I'm going to approach the use of maximizer, of activator, of command in the context of a facilitation opportunity. And we will flex with one another in that regard. But I do think it requires us to be very clear on how each of our leading strengths actually present themselves in formal circumstances and in informal circumstances. And some of that, frankly, just happens to come with time invested in working with one another and really seeing each other through our strengths. So, for example, one of the most memorable phrases that you have uttered in not only our conversations working with one another, but how you've introduced me to others is through the framing of my context. And even though I've not actually shared the story that I shared earlier on this podcast with you, you have always shared that context for Alejandro is a really important thing. And you shared with others and you share with me. I always try and provide a little bit more of the background to Alejandro so that he feels informed, that he feels comfortable. And likewise, I'm always cognizant of the fact that the maximizer in you is that superpower that allows me to make sure that I'm in sync with you when we are, for example, have an opportunity to co-present for a large organization, for an influential organization that may want to collaborate in ways that we may not even be able to anticipate it down the line. And so I'm wary of the fact that, for example, I will need to increase my command in a joint facilitation scenario when I know that maximizer is on fire for you with the broader relationship that you're trying to build with a potential client or a current client. And so having that acute understanding of each other's strengths, being strength whisperers for one another, has been a godsend, frankly, for me to be able to work with somebody like yourself, not just facilitation, not just coaching, not just pitching, but in a whole host of areas.
I really agree. And I think that it's powerful for listeners to think through some of the filters that you just laid down, Alejandro. I've observed with us sometimes when we're preparing just for meetings for different things, we might even ask or state, hey, these are the strengths for me that are going to be in my lead position. These are the things that I'm going in there with, and talk about what we're getting into through the lens of strengths. Then we'll map out, okay, well, this is what Alejandro's coming to say. Then we'll actually figure out my arranger strength will kick into gear, and we'll start looking at like, well, maybe what might be the best way to order this, to organize this and put this together. Maybe Alejandro really should be kicking off this meeting and presenting first. Maybe this group, if we know their strengths or if we don't, but we have an understanding of where they're at organizationally, we might say, hey, you know what? Giving them the Cliff Notes version on context is going to be a great way to tie them right into the why so we can move forward to where we're going. Some other organizations, they might need to really understand where we're going first and then back into the why. But when we talk through preparing for what we might be getting into, we will actually call out different strengths or even invite certain strengths out. Me having activator as high as I do, you having deliberative as high as you do. I value that because some of my strengths will be more of a gas pedal, and some of your strengths, intellection, deliberative, will be just that important brake pedal. If I gave any of you as listeners keys to the vehicle of your dreams, I said, hey, there's one caveat. You only get a gas pedal. That's it. And you can't install a brake pedal. Are you taking it? I'm going to guess the answer to that is no. Or you only get a brake pedal. So it's easy for us individually to say, oh gosh, why does an activator need to feel this urgency and to keep pushing things and moving it forward? And then on the flip side of that, why is deliberative and intellection need some time to think, analytical need the time to analyze? And guess what? We need these balances, this yin and this yang. One of my bases hanging over my shoulder right now is a yin and yang. You can see it. While we're talking, our listeners can't, but that whole blend is actually the journey from self-awareness to team awareness, which actually makes 2 + 2 not equal 4, but equal an exponentially higher number because we have that balance. Alejandro, I want to change gears for a moment. It's just hard to believe how quickly we can work through time when we're chatting. You have really been moving forward and advancing the work of strengths in the lens of diversity, equity, and inclusivity initiatives within many organizations. OVP has been establishing themselves as true experts within that space. Can you tell us about the connection between strengths and diversity, equity, and inclusion type initiatives within organizations and how they tie together?
Thanks for asking that, Darren, and appreciate your kind words for that. We have found that part and parcel of helping organizations reach levels of success and excellence at a sustained level really requires an understanding of culture. And in order to understand culture, certainly through the use of the lens of strengths, we need to understand some of the gaps and some of the minefields that organizations find themselves confronted with when trying to acknowledge cultural realities and build from them. With many organizations, this notion of equity, diversity, and inclusion, which is the manner in which we choose to talk about it, is a misunderstood and sometimes considered to be provocative third rail in the realm of organizational development, behavioral development, organizational culture work. And part of that is because of the sensitivity of the language. Equity, diversity, and inclusion connotate certain things and behaviors in the workplace. And what we've tried to do, and we believe pretty successfully based on our experiences with some of our clients, is help organizations get much more comfortable with the role that terms like equity, inclusivity, diversity have in organizational work environments by using strengths language, which is familiar to many organizations, as a bridging mechanism to a level of comfort, trust, and safety in the realm of equity, diversity, and inclusion. And if you think about foundational principles or elements of strengths include the development and creation of trust, the compassion of the human connection, the notion of predictability or stability, and hope. That pyramid kind of approach to developing culture, of which Clifton Strengths is a strong proponent, really requires us to use language that gets across the idea that these words, command, context, input, learner, etc., are in fact have the same meaning and the same manifestation as equity, inclusivity, diversity in a slightly different context. And the more comfortable we can become using the language of strengths to identify areas of opportunity with regard to equity and developing equitable culture and equitable opportunities within our work cultures, the more successful these organizations will be in terms of integrating these ideas of equity, diversity, and inclusion into their main operating frame, if you will. Because one of the things that we have to acknowledge is that within organizations, for-profit, not-for-profit, public sector, private sector, in the notion of culture, there are concerns related to homogeneity and being able to offer quote unquote remedies or fixes to problems in a homogeneous manner. But the reality is that we all come from different spaces, different places, just as we were describing earlier with regard to how it is that we approach strengths. We need language that allows for us to acknowledge those differences in a safe, yet in a brave space, so as to not feel that we are isolating or signaling disapproval for individual groups. And strengths language helps close that gap of misunderstanding in the realm of equity, diversity, and inclusion. So we found a number of organizations that have come to us with those issues, those problems, and with the use of strengths as kind of that bridging platform to a level of safety and comfort, have really begun to kind of embrace the notion of, yes, we need our leaders to become much more equitable in their approach to leadership. And it doesn't mean trying to displace individuals, but rather it's a real strengths approach to the manifestation of inclusivity, of equity, of diversity.
You mentioned that there's connotations of what diversity, equity, inclusivity are in the workplaces. And I was wondering, I don't think we have time to get into all three. What are some of the connotations on what equity is versus what it actually is? Diversity, inclusivity, it seems like people might be able to get there and get a little clearer on that a little quicker. But I've definitely had conversations where there does seem to be some confusion around what equity actually is. Can you help bridge the gaps from what the connotations of equity are to what it actually is in the workplace that plugs into what you were just talking about?
One of the most common misnomers of the term equity is that it is a synonym for equality. And if we think about equality in the context of work, we often are thinking about it in the context of equality of outcomes. And when you go down that path, logically, when you think about equality of outcomes, you're thinking about, well, everyone should have the same outcome with the same inputs. What equity is and what differentiates it is this idea of equality of access. In other words, access to be able to participate in processes, in areas of focus for an organization, so that at the end of the process, the outcomes are reflective of everyone's ability to participate in the best ways that they are able to. And how strengths makes that linkage is by leveraging everyone's identified and identifiable strengths allows for equity of access to participate in a process that will eventually lead to greater and more consistent outcomes with respect to the goals that put forth by an organization. And so the difference really is about inputs and outcomes. Equity is really about the inputs and the accessibility to those inputs and the participation. And equality is that notion of, well, we want it all to come out the same at the end. And that's just not a realistic approach to running any kind of business.
I really like the simple statement that you distinguished in there as best as you can. And this is, again, you said you're going to do your best to answer this, but I think a powerful summary takeaway there was equality of access. That is really, really an important piece, because I agree there's a lot of times people hear equity and just think equality, and there's more to it than that. And there's more to it than we can cover in this conversation, but that's a little bit of a highlight reel with that. Last question I want to ask you here, because this is just such a fantastic conversation that we're having. Can you talk a little bit about how strengths can be incorporated into lean initiatives and process improvements? I know you have a really strong background in that, in your work and in your experience, even pre-OVP and in your work experience before that. But how do those two merge? Because a lot of times people might see process as the hard skills, so to speak, and then strengths and culture, these are all the soft skills. And yet it's imperative that they work together to create meaningful transformation in organizations. But what have you seen? How does strengths kind of help fuel that, or the other way around?
Well, if you think about the underlying concept to Kaizen, which is a Japanese term for continuous improvement, you think about this notion of process development, design, and the concept of eliminating waste. The idea of Clifton Strengths having a connection to Six Sigma continuous improvement process work that I'm very familiar with, that we train my individual practitioners at OVP with regard to Clifton Strengths and process design, is to make sure that once we understand what our foundation is with regard to Clifton Strengths and what our strengths are as a team as well as individually, those same principles that give you optimal and suboptimal opportunities to behave and manifest that particular strength have applicability to when we are doing process mapping and we are determining how it is that we can best move this process that has 15 steps down to 8. And by utilizing a strength like analytical, we can then put into position those that really resonate with analytical to begin to do root cause analysis or other structural processes that are germane to Six Sigma work and continuous improvement work to really begin to connect those strengths and apply them to make sure that our processes actually are reflective of our best thinking, which are our strengths. So that's really how I think about those two spheres, as really being connected, again, once again, by that language, that shared language of strengths.
Alejandro, we could continue this conversation for several more hours, and I love chatting with you. And I just want to thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your journey of being a people-first leader. For our listeners out there, I got to ask, are you ready to discover your strengths to accelerate into life like Alejandro has? We believe in this path so much that we're offering our listeners the opportunity to discover their top 5 Clifton Strengths. Just email us at Brandon, BRANDON, at 34strong.com with the subject line top 5 to request your StrengthsFinder code. And of course, share with us any insights that you took away from your conversation with Alejandro. Alejandro, if people want to get in touch with you or learn more about OVP or you personally, where can they do that? What's the best way to get connected with you?
Once again, thank you for allowing me to be here with you today, Darren. www.ovpconsulting.com. Again, www.ovpconsulting.com is our website. And folks can email me directly at alejandro@ovpmanagementconsulting.com. If you have any questions to me directly, feel free to reach out. Our team is available. We would love to help folks get better at what they do. That's our motto.
Thank you so much, Alejandro, for joining us. Any final closing nuggets that you just want to share as we're wrapping up before we close out?
It's been a pleasure, Darren. As always, I love vibing with you in these kind of circumstances, kind of like two musicians trying to come together and have a jam session. I would just like to say, for those listeners that are interested in better understanding how strengths can show up in your life, just take to heart that this is a journey that is a lifelong journey. And there are aspects of this that may be for you. There are aspects that you may not understand, but stick on the path and strengths will begin to reveal themselves to you over time. And myself, my team, Darren, 34 Strong, their entire team are all here and ready and willing to help in whatever way we can to help you down that path.
Thanks, Alejandro. And yeah, it's a lifelong process, that is for sure. We just keep discovering and finding different ways that they change and that they evolve. Dear listener, I want to thank you so much for joining us on the Strengths Whisperer. We will see you soon.